class. It's not this specific class, but I've been in previous classes.
Okay, well, good.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you. I have a question. I forgot to register for this specific class. I mean, online.
It's okay.
It's okay?
No problem, yeah.
Thank you. I mean, do I still have to dwell in the future? Or? Okay.
Still have to what in the
Do I still have to dwell in the future? Or? Okay.
still have to what in the future?
Do I have to register now for next time?
I'm good. I'm live.
Oh. Well, welcome. My name is Steve Taft, and tonight we're talking about Henry George's Progress and Poverty, Book 4. And as Book 4 indicates, this is the sixth in a series of talks about progress and poverty by Henry George, sort of a serial adventure into the by Henry George, sort of a serial adventure into the text. And up to this point in Progress and Poverty, Henry George has identified rent as, quote, the receiver of increased production, which material progress gives, but which labor fails to obtain, close quote. And seeing that the antagonism is not, and I'm quoting George again, not between labor and capital, as popularly believed, but is in reality between labor and capital on one side and land ownership on the other. So at this point, we together understand what economic rent is. And George calls it the extra production that can be had from a property over an equal application of effort on the least productive land in use. So here in today's inquiry, as described by George, and I'll read directly from his text, the further question is, what causes rent to advance? What is the force or necessity that, as productive power increases, distributes a greater and greater proportion of the produce as rent? So that's the exploration for tonight's talk, and that's where we go. There are three factors of material production: population, improvements in the arts of production and exchange, that's George's terminology, and improvements in knowledge, education, government, police, manners, and morals. So how does economic rent arise? As George puts it, to ascertain the effects of material progress upon the distribution of wealth, let us therefore consider the effects of increase of population apart from improvements in the arts, and then the effect of improvement in the arts apart from the increase in population. So what we're really talking about is four scenarios that are addressed in Progress and Poverty. Community founded on land of uniform productivity with a growing population, community founded on land of unequal productivity with a growing population, community founded on land of uniform productivity with improving arts of production, and community founded on land of unequal productivity with improving arts of production. But before we get into this, I want to emphasize something that George mentions only briefly, but that is very important to our understanding of wealth creation. And that is the inherent power of civilized society to unleash human desires, human creativity, human imagination. When we are living in an uncivilized way, without cooperation among us, without trade, the day is filled for every individual with meeting basic needs. Find food, find shelter, and stay warm are all one can do because one is doing all those things every single day. Having more than is needed means only that the excess needs protecting, So other needs could well go wanting while the excess is being protected. But this is not, according to George, a normal state for mankind. It's a normal state for animals. As George says, man is not an ox who, when he has eaten his fill, lies down to chew the cud. He is the daughter of the horse leech who constantly asks for more. Now that to me is a memorable sentence. Yes, it's borrowed from the Bible, but comparing human desire to that of a horse leech is, shall we say, as mind-expanding as anything Shakespeare ever put down. So what George is saying is that civilization in its norms and structures is what allows mankind to exercise its imagination. The effect, as far as economics is concerned, is that desire can be unlimited. We as individuals can always imagine more when we are nested in a civilized society. And desire, both for the economist and the business person, equals demand. So to understand the four scenarios, we have to place our population on two different lands, a land of equal productivity throughout and a land of diminishing productivity. So imagine a beautiful, unbounded land awash in water and wildlife and fertile soil. Here is our land. Had I drawn the water and the wildlife and the fertile soil, this would have looked like a piece of paper picked up off of Grand Central's floor after rush hour. So I just decided to let you use your imagination. Okay, it's green at least, and it's all equal. The first person arrives there alone. We're just taking any distance, it doesn't matter. But this line here is this, just flattened out. And someone decides to arrive here and picks a spot to try to build a home. Now, this first person arriving will have all of nature's bounty and yet be poor. Just as we were describing, he or she will have to be a jack of all trades, but a master of none. Food, clothing, shelter are going to be the priorities for their time, day after day after day. Even if the shelter is built, it has to be maintained and repaired from time to time. So even with a family there, they would still be too busy to teach the children. And in any case, the children won't be able to learn any more than the parents already know. These people won't be able to, this family won't be able to venture far without building a wagon or shoeing a horse. And that is hard to do. Both of those things are hard to do when you're alone. Realistically, you'd be able to have a small farm or hunt to supply your food and maintain a supply of wood for cooking, heating, and you'd make repairs to your home, and that would be your life. But as more people arrive, their advantage is to take property reasonably close by. Here we have our second person arriving. Out of this vast landscape of equal opportunity from the land, they still choose to move reasonably close to the person or family that's already there. Now, why would they do that? This way, chores can be shared. Even trades can begin to happen. And a day, therefore, becomes more productive. As more people arrive, the advantage with equal productivity of the land is always to be proximate to others. In this way, specialized skills can develop that benefit all in the community. Eventually, even a teacher can be hired to properly educate the children. You know, something like an iron mine or excess crops are valueless until there are enough people around to demand them and have the time to work them or distribute them. Where land is of equal productivity, rent arises from the population density. The farmer of, just making it up, a hectare of corn, surrounded by hundreds of people, engaged in a variety of different tasks around his hectare-sized farm, will enjoy a better life of goods and services than will the same farmer on the same exact plot of land surrounded by no one. Now, it must be remembered that, be it for land or labor, productiveness is not measured by one thing, but, as George says, all desired things. What he's talking about is that wealth is fungible. In a sense, it's tradable. When you have wealth of one type, it can be exchanged for wealth of another type. This means that improvements in one type of production allows for greater productivity in other areas as well. Look at a newly forming settlement. If there is an improvement in the manufacture of clothing, then more labor can be spent on producing other necessities like food or transportation or housing. Because of an improvement in making clothing, more time is allowed for other work, so more food or better transportation and housing can result. So any improvement in producing wealth can allow for greater production of other types of wealth as well. Everyone benefits. And this is sort of the scenario we get, where these bars rising up from the uniform land represent areas of productivity. Just because of where the population gathers, there's more wealth being produced in the middle where more people have congregated, or they're surrounded by more people. Does this make sense? So, proximity to people allows easier access to those things that make for better life. It's easier to get an education, easier to get a repair done, easier to find and acquire finer things like tailored clothes. When people live within an easy reach of each other, it allows for specialization of skills. That's a key, the specialization of skills, just by virtue of other people being around. So equivalent labor on equivalent property will yield a richer life when nearer the heart of the population. We can put numbers on this to help understand it. Again, these numbers are just made up, but the circles here correspond to the areas of productivity in this green chart. And the numbers here represent what George would call the difference between the lowest one in use and the highest one would be the economic rent. So what this chart is saying is that if people are living and working in the 12 zone, obviously people are working in the 16 and 22. And so the economic rent is the difference between 20 and 12, or 8. And the wage is pretty much, for purposes of tonight, the rest, the 16. Now,
So are you saying that the more people create
can
wealth-
we leave our questions for the end?
Okay, I'm sorry.
That's okay. That's quite okay. But I'm glad you have a question. We'll get to it after. So remember, economic rent is the extra production that can be had from a property over an equal application of effort, or at least, or the least, an equal application of effort on the least productive land in use. The areas of higher rent are where the most wealth is produced. Now, where land is of unequal or diminishing productivity, okay, now our green land instead of being equal all the way across, like this green verdant field I showed you before, now there's a differentiation in the productivity of the land. And you can see it's remarkably similar to the sort of effect you get from virtue of a population. It's the same because the principle is the same. Land use in the center people are going to arrive at the most productive land because they're going to have a choice. They're going to see the difference between less productive land and the most productive land. So the first people to arrive are going to congregate where land is most productive. But the effect is that they're proximate to each other and still benefit from having economic interactions with each other. But the difference is, as the population grows and less productive land has to be taken into use because the better land gets full or claimed, then you're going to have a drop-off in productivity just by virtue of the land, not because you're further from the center of population. So we have to be careful now of wages. What happened, because wages can fall off in this situation. If population growth is adding to productivity faster than the productivity of marginal land in use diminishes, wages and the minimal lifestyle would still rise. Increased productivity would offset the bringing less productive land into use. And so even though as a proportion of total wealth, wages would not keep pace, the actual lifestyle of people living on the outer areas of that community would still experience a rise in wages because overall productivity is increased. But if productivity of the population increase exactly offsets the decrease in productivity of new land taken into use, wages of the minimum lifestyle would remain flat. But if the new land is taken into use was so diminished in productivity that the increase in labor productivity from population growth couldn't offset it, then the minimum lifestyle will fall. Even as the overall rent rises and overall productivity rises, wages would fall. As Henry George notes, this is the circumstance in which inequality begins. Quote, the aggregate wealth production as compared with the aggregate expenditure of labor will be greater, although its distribution will be more unequal. So, now let's assume a stable population, not a growing population. But what's different is that the arts of production improve. There's productivity in discoveries that make production easier. You can produce the same amount with fewer people. When the settlement is larger, and even though the population is stable, while everyone's lives are improved because the division of labor is a wonderful thing, the greater share of economic benefit accrues to those claiming the central locations within the town. There is an increase in economic rent without a corresponding increase in wages. For example, let's say there are 500 workers in our community, and due to production efficiencies, 20 find themselves no longer needed. What's going to be the economic effect? Well, for one, it'll be hard for other workers to ask for raises, so wages at best are going to stagnate. And if any of the 20 do find work, it'll be to make more of something that the town previously had available, growing the overall wealth of the town without growing wages. And for two, if these 20 can't get work within the town, they'll be forced to start working land at the edges of the town, otherwise known as the margin. So the effect is like this, where I don't know if you can see in the back, but we still have the fundamental structure of productivity in the community, but the red lines here are showing the unnecessary workers, made unnecessary because productivity, the arts of productivity were enhanced. So they either have to get another job and can't really fight for a wage increase, or they have to move out to lower productivity land. So again, and as they do that, rents will rise, economic rent will rise, but wages won't. And wages will likely fall. So as a community grows ever more, what happens is that productivity begins to overshadow the original productivity of the land in the community's middle even. As cities form, the original productivity of the land becomes irrelevant. Land values in a city center are driven completely by the economic strength of the surrounding population. Certainly not based on agriculture, right? It's based on all the economic wealth creation that surrounds a city center and is within a city center. So what we see now is that there's a typical economic condition where economic progress does not raise wages, but rather raises economic rent. But life is still good. While there's a disparity between rich and poor, the poor are not condemned to what Thoreau had called quiet desperation. There's still a minimal lifestyle. They're not desperate. They choose where they're living, and they still benefit from the productivity of the community that they're on the outskirts of. But their lifestyle was not what it would have been maybe a generation before. Now, there is another force at work here that we haven't discussed yet, and that throws kind of a monkey wrench into the economic machine, which does make life worse for all, and especially the poor. While we have seen that material progress leads to an increase of economic rent, we have not considered that the expectation of rising economic rents leads to land speculation. George defines this as, quote, the holding of land for a higher price than it would otherwise bring. So here's our circle of productivity in our community where the land is efficiently used. But once speculation starts, things change. What I'm trying to illustrate here is that these crosses are where land is claimed and it's in use, and productivity is growing. And because productivity is growing, rents are starting to rise because of what we discussed a few moments ago. And people get it in their minds that, well, you can see that eventually this community is going to need to take over that land over there. And so they take it without planning to actually produce anything on it and just hold it until the price of the land goes up enough for them to want to sell it. So that's what I'm putting here. This is an area where land is held for speculation. So this slice of the pie, so to speak, is not available to people who would normally move out from the 20 area and move into the 16 area. Because this is taken now, they have to move into the 12 area. And what that does is the same as we've discussed before. What that does is lower the wage and increase the rent. So speculation has a truly pernicious effect on a community's well-being. It is the force evolved by material progress, and I'm quoting, "It's the force evolved by material progress which tends constantly to increase rent in a greater ration than progress increases production, and thus constantly tends, as material progress goes on and productive power increases, to reduce wages, not merely relatively, but absolutely. It is this expansive force which, operating with great power in new countries, brings them, seemingly long before their time, the social diseases of older countries." And I will close by quoting from George again in Book 4. "But as wages cannot be permanently reduced below the point at which laborers will consent to work and reproduce, nor interest below the point at which capital will be devoted to production, there is a limit which restrains the speculative advance of rent." Do we follow that? It's because people aren't going to work for nothing. So there has to be some reasonable lifestyle available to them. Hence, speculation cannot have the same scope to advance rent in countries where wages and interests are already near the minimum, as in countries where they are considerably above it. And since this is the 6th lecture in a series and ending for the season, as it were, this is what's going to pass for an economic cliffhanger. Yet that there is in all progressive countries a constant tendency in the speculative advance of rent to overpass the limit where production would cease is, I think, shown by recurring seasons of industrial paralysis. In other words, recessions. And it's a matter for which will be more fully examined in the next book. And with that, I'll stop talking and be open to any questions you might have. And if anyone is listening to this in a recorded version, the text will be available. And also these brilliantly drawn charts will be available on the web as well. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, we'll entertain questions. I think, Nina, you had a question at the beginning of this. And,
What my question was.
okay, now, let me explain the technology in case we can't figure it out. This is on being recorded, the YouTube being live streamed right now, but after the end of the thing, it's going to be recorded. So what we're trying to do is get the audio into that mic by way of this thing going through the speakers. So even though you might think you don't need this microphone, that thing needs a microphone. So.
Hi there.
Hi.
I'm guessing your graphs are based on the monopolization of land. That's like the current situation.
Well, This is not necessarily about the monopolization of land, but just a representation of land that's in use. Okay? Monopolization of land starts to get into where you're speculating, and land is just being held. At least that's my interpretation of it.
I don't know if this is an answerable question, but can you...
Give me a shot.
Could you say, could you sort of illustrate how those graphs would look under an LVT system, a land value tax system?
Well, yeah. It would look like this, okay? Because the principle is the same. What Henry George is describing is just where, or how rather, wealth is created and the effect that has on land value. These circles with the numbers in them represent productivity based on the location in that community, okay? So it's an automatic representation of how economic rent is created. Because economic rent, as we now understand, is always going to be the difference between where you are and in terms of the productive potential and the least productive land in use. And the key is in use. So if this community has expanded to the point where it's using the land that is, you know, hypothetically a 12 value of productivity, the center of the land, of the community is going to be a 20. Rent is going to be 8. If the community is somewhat smaller and only expanded to the 16 ring, rent will be 4. Okay, so it's not a representation of monopolization. It's not a representation of land value tax per se. It's just a representation of economic principle. I mean, this chart can apply to any economic situation, right? It's based on natural human interaction, and it's based on natural productivity that we find in the land under our feet. The question is whether you're going to recognize the land value and tax it or not. Now, as we know, we're in a community now that does not recognize that. That doesn't mean this chart doesn't exist. There's still, you know, most people would acknowledge land in the heart of Manhattan is more valuable than any property in the Bronx, for example, or Staten Island, right? And as you go out further, land values would decrease further still. So the rings are valid, but we don't recognize it. That's the issue. So I don't know if that answers your question, the unanswerable question. I hope I did, though.
Yeah.
Is there any way you could, present how private property was established over, natural laws?
Well, I don't know that, the short answer is no, but I could guess, okay? And I don't know if the question is properly phrased as saying over natural law, because it seems to me the idea of private property is tied in with the idea of productivity. I mean, if someone isn't going to have control over the work they do on their land, whether it grow a crop or mend clothes or whatever they do, if they're not going to be the beneficiary of their own work, they're not going to have any incentive to do it. So the idea of private property is probably a natural extension of human desire to make life better. But the idea of private property being so sacred that the value of it shouldn't feed into the community that creates that value in the first place. Because, as we discussed in my brief talk here, someone farming a hectare, if they're near a larger community, they're going to enjoy a better life than someone who's tilling the same land far from a community, right? And so that land near a community is going to have a greater value, even though the work being done on that land is the same. And that is a difference that we don't appreciate in our tax code. And I think the idea of private property has perhaps helped dissuade us from thinking in terms of land value tax. But, I have to admit, like I said at the beginning, I'd be guessing.
I have a question, unless somebody wants to think about theirs. This is a very interesting chapter, and like what Steve was getting at is that we're now at the end of the first half of the book, and we're going to continue on in January. Ibrahima's going to take on book number 5, so maybe we'll answer some of those cliffhanger questions. But one of the things that I found interesting was Henry George's idea about improvements in government was one of the phrases. He also said betterment of government, and he's talking about these efficiencies. And I thought maybe I would ask you to comment on that, but also this is the chapter where he, even though he disposed of the Malthusian idea about the population and how it kind of turns to ruin, I suppose, but he says that he attacked it from a different way, and on page 244, what he was saying that if rent increases with the improvements in the methods of production and exchange, having also previously proved that increased population also increased the productivity of labor, that with those two things that it further disproves the Malthusian theory. So I don't know if that was clear the way I described that, but that's what he was getting at on page 244.
Yeah, and Steve, what's his name, Sklar, is it?
Sklar.
He covered that in his talk. So I just in preparing tonight, for the sake of not being too repetitious, I thought I would allow him that honor of having described it.
Comment on today it's like commonly said that government needs to be smaller, maybe they say it needs to be smarter, but in Henry George's words, would you want to comment on what he was getting at when he talked about betterment of government?
Well, government is the body that makes and enforces the rules that an economy plays by. And the better the rules, the more efficient the economy is going to be. And in terms of enforcing the rules, the less corruption there is, the more efficient the economy is going to be. So these are just broad strokes, but to me it seems very clear that the best economy a community can have is going to be because the government is as good as it can be. Otherwise, we get into scenarios where corrupt practices skew results, ill-conceived taxes distort the value of production or the value of labor. The common scenario we have where land value is not recognized as a valid source to fund a community, just that lack of recognition causes a lot of distortion in what would otherwise be a far more efficient economy. So yeah, I mean, better government, I think, is a very important thing. And I think it's good to have, if I can just politicize it a little bit, I think it's good to have in government people who actually believe in government, or the job isn't going to get done, or they're not even going to aspire to do it well. So, and we can see examples of that too. So, you know, I wish George had elaborated more on it, at least in this material for tonight, but I think it's clear how it impacts us.
So we got a little time. Nina, do you remember what you were thinking of? Current events, maybe you can.
Just to piggyback a little bit on the private property, I'm just saying, like, biblically, how was land really supposed to be, you know, used by the people, you know, biblically, and how they have, say, expressed how it should be fair to all.
Well, I'm not shall we say, a student of the Bible or any religious text. However, I do recall something about there being a year of jubilation, or the year of Jubilee, or something like that, where every 50 years or so, all debts are canceled and all land is kind of redistributed. And the idea behind that, whether it's a viable economic approach or not, the idea behind that is, I think, very Georgist in its heart, which is that land is not for individuals, but for the community to benefit. And, you know, it's a different approach than an attempt to collect land value tax. But in spirit, I think I take it to be similar.
Yeah, there is a text on the analogy between the biblical way of distributing land, what you're talking about. I can't remember the title, but I have it at home. You got something?
Well, I could just respond to that.
Okay.
That's actually a really interesting point, because the idea of when monotheism came, it was supposed to break the clans. And the idea of this, not the superiority of the nuclear family or the extended family. So that's probably also the reason why private property, the idea of owning it and continually owning it, but monotheism came to break that idea of the clan worship. Your family is superior than other families. So that's actually pretty interesting about the biblical.
Anybody want to ask a question about anything that came up today in terms of maybe a very recent news article about Amazon and land value? We could, but if we don't have that, we'll
We'll get that on next, we'll get that next. Got it.
Just in terms of this recent reading we had where he was talking about lands of inferior value and how that affects wages, et cetera. I was thinking about how urban sprawl, they play up that, we've talked about that.
You said sprawl?
Sprawl, urban sprawl, yeah. And how we keep moving out of the edges of the city and all that. Isn't that a good example of going to inferior land, the margin of cultivation, production, and all that?
Not necessarily, because remember that it's the same chart, whether it's due to land of diminishing use as you move from the center, or as you move from a population center, right? They both have the same effect. So in the New York area, I'm not knowledgeable enough to say how productive the land is, 5 miles out, 10 miles out, 15 miles out. But I can tell you that as you move from the population center, the same effect is going to happen.
Yeah, I had maybe a comment on that. Outside of the Henry George School, you know, I'm a scholar of infrastructure, and this is a question and a topic that's dear to me. But I think what might be prompting your question had to do with the sprawl. Of course, we're going to have to spread out the phone lines and the sewer lines and the roads, and maybe we'll need a bridge now that we're going across the river. So at some point, when we replace all these things, if the city hasn't grown to produce the revenue to keep those things up, we could be in a situation where disinvestment happens, like in Detroit and such. So I guess at the beginning of the spurt, I suppose there might be some economy of just going along with the sprawl. But did you want to comment about the effect of George's idea in terms of infrastructure costs?
Land value tax, if it were implemented, if we had to have the blessing to live under it or over it, since we're talking about land, I do believe our economic system would be more equitable and more efficient. And there would be a lot of needs that we currently have to meet through government that are artificially created because we don't recognize land value. The point I want to get to is that land value tax would amply supply the needs of a community. I think there would be plenty there to rebuild or improve infrastructure, if only for the reason that if the community is focused on collecting land value, a better infrastructure helps to increase the value of the land that they're taxing. So the incentives totally align. And of course, we don't have that now. But I think it's a wonderful match, land value and infrastructure concerns.
Did you have a question? Okay. Well, we've got a pretty good audience. We've asked some good questions, and Steve done an admirable job of covering the book number 4.
Thank you.
I
Short but sweet, I hope.
Yeah, I like the diagrams, and for the people watching the video, it's going to be recorded, and whatever you see, if you got any questions, please write or call the Henry George School of Social Science, and we can answer any questions that might come up.
I'll get back to you.
Okay, and so from here on in January, we're going to go to book number 5. It's going to be class 7 out of a total of 12 classes, where we're going to cover the entire Progress in Poverty. And as you see, we're going very methodically through concepts and discarding ideas that do not serve the purposes of a coherent science of political economy. And that was Henry George's task in writing this book, is to take on the experts as of 1879 and lay out a very coherent science of political economy. And I think we all agree that he did a fine job, and now it's our turn to educate others into the wisdom. So appreciate your words, and let's give Steve a round of applause. So I guess now I'll get Ibrahima, and we can move to shut things down and talk among ourselves.
Do you have another question?
Yeah.
Oh, we got another question?
No, it's not for the tape. I was just saying, could we discuss Amazon?
Oh, yeah, right.
Everybody signed it?
Yeah.
Do we know where the off button is?
So what's your take on that, Steve?
On Amazon?
Yeah.
I think it's a mixed scenario. On the one hand, I can't imagine that getting, what was it, $1 billion? I forget the numbers of tax.
Around 2 billion.
2 billion, but over a period of time, like 12 years or something. That is not in the scheme of New York City, nor in the scheme of Amazon in their balance sheet, in their profit statement, a lot, okay? So I don't think it's the disaster in that regard that some people have expressed. However, if it's not going to be significant to Amazon, why? You know, why did New York give it up? You know, at a time when the city's kind of screaming for infrastructure improvements, like to the subway. So it, you know, that's why I say it's kind of a mixed scenario. And plus, if it's truly, they say it's tied to the creation of 25,000 jobs.
Right, that's what we.
If it's truly tied to the creation of 25,000 jobs, and truly tied to Amazon's profitability going forward, because profits have a way of disappearing in high-taxed areas and reappearing in lower-taxed areas. I mean, just look at Apple, right? Then I think in the long run, New York could be okay. You know, there was some talk before this evening started about how people were already trading apartments in Long Island City, where Amazon is promised to go, and flipping them evidently already. Apartments are being flipped, and by text messages, you know. I've never bought a home by text message. Certainly not without going to see it. So there's kind of a speculative fervor that seems to be evident. Speculative fervors tend not to end well, and I don't know that that's necessarily Amazon's fault or the city's fault that people are getting excited about this or overly excited about this. But I was going to say, with 25,000 jobs, if it's truly tied to that and truly tied to the corporate profitability of Amazon, in the long run, New York will be okay, and there will be money to improve our infrastructure. It would just be nice to have it now when the need is so pressing. So, and I think people in Long Island City, some people are going to get priced out. There's going to be a little bit of a San Francisco, Silicon Valley effect. You know, at the same time, Google is expanding in Manhattan. So it's kind of I think, inevitable that in the nation's largest, and some would argue greatest city, that the nation's largest and greatest companies would want to have a significant presence. But again, you know, it's a shame that New York felt it had to give something away to be attractive, when I don't think they really needed to give much away and could still be attractive. That's my take.
Well, I think on one hand, Henry George, considering he started back in 79 or something like that, was totally brilliant to foresee or to put this whole picture together, because is so much happening today that ties in to his philosophy. And I think the thing with Amazon is really so speculative because you really don't know. Of course, you brought up something about apartments being flipped. Now, the real estate market right now has become very soft. And here it is within a day, and the real estate is starting to change.
Well, what's the rule in real estate? Location, 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 right? So if you happen to be a homeowner in Long Island City, no matter what anyone else says, I would presume you're pretty happy today.
Mhm. Well, I think it's not just in Long Island City. I think what's going to happen, is that just the nature of the fact that there are jobs for more workers, they don't necessarily have to live in Long Island City. They can live in other areas and commute.
No, but, you know, look at this chart again. And now let's pretend Amazon is in the center circle,
Right.
right? That's the effect you're going to see. People can still work in the middle and live out here,
Exactly. So
but the
that-
values are going to be near where,
You don't feel like the values are going to be outside of that middle? I think they definitely will.
no, sure.
Because there's not enough room just in the middle for the amount of people who are going to want to be with Amazon. No questions. Pardon me? I'm sorry, what was that?
No,
You know, New York has 8 million people, give or take, living in it.
Yes,
And during the workday, there's something like 15 or 16 million people here, right? Who enter the city or during the workday. So think about, 25,000 in terms of numbers like that is not that great,
it may not be that great, but I think it will have an impact just based on what the situation is.
Oh, it will. And I'm just saying that, and I think other people are saying too, that impact is going to be, have the greatest effect in the area of Long Island City,
Oh, definitely. Yeah,
right?
totally. But I think other areas are going to benefit.
Sure. Other areas, Astoria will probably benefit too, I mean, Forest Hills will probably benefit too,
I think the other thing that people haven't recognized is that there are going to be lots of other issues that are going to happen. Can our subway system afford so many more people to go on trains? I mean, our trains are not efficient.
Well, let's think about that a little bit, okay? It's not like you're going to have 25,000 people piling on the 7 train, right, to come into Manhattan. The offices are going to be in Long Island City. So you're going to have some people living in Manhattan because they're going to be decent paying jobs, right? So some people are going to live in Manhattan and commute in the reverse direction. Some people are going to, maybe I don't know the subways well enough. Maybe, what is it, the G line?
the 7.
No, the G line that goes through Brooklyn and Queens.
Yeah. Right there.
People could take the G line to go to work, and maybe that'll get busier. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be such a one-dimensional strain on the subway line. That's all I'm saying.
Do you think those jobs are going to be minimum wage?
No, Amazon said they're going to be 6-figure jobs.
Or
Yes, I heard
2,500 six-figure jobs?
Yeah, they said $150,000 senior jobs.
Is that going to be 1 or 2 jobs, or is that going to be the whole?